How would you rate the current state of fighting games? Great, terrible, good, maybe bad? I feel like if you're just looking at the sales numbers, you'd get an impression that things are better than ever. Tekken 8 and Street Fighter 6 are selling faster than their previous entries. Guilty Gear finally entered mainstream. SNK is restoring their former glory, and Mortal Kombat is... anyway, there's a lot to be happy about. Yet, if you look at the bigger picture, it doesn't really reflect this. We typically get only 1 or 2 major games per year, and if those games are not from Bandai Namco or Capcom, their lifespan is usually going to be pretty short. When even such established companies like SNK and ArcSys can't guarantee success, what can be said about indie developers? More often than not, indie fighting games are little miracles that exist in spite of how difficult it is to make them. Each one is a labor of love that requires a monumental amount of effort and passion to get off the ground. In spite of all that work, they almost never get the appreciation or profits that they deserve. But you know what the worst part is? There might not be a way to change anything about this. But before we get into it, if you end up enjoying the video, please consider leaving a like or subscribing. Thank you. First of all, what counts as independent? It's not the most concrete term, and the line has been somewhat blurred over the years. While people used to apply it to only small self-published titles, it has come to include various low-budget productions and games that do have a publisher, but are not beholden to the usual corporate demands or pressure of stakeholders. That's pretty much what we're going to be talking about as well. Now, it might surprise some of you, but indie fighting games have been around pretty much since the very beginning. For example, just a year after Street Fighter 2, there was Cha-Cha Fighter V and Fist Fighters. Back then, games were usually simple enough that just a few people could put something out within a few months, if they had the know-how. On a technical level, these were just as indie as modern fighting games. But on a spiritual level, they are somewhat removed from what we've come to associate with indie games. Many of them were made as a result of the wild Street Fighter and later Mortal Kombat craze. Back when making fighting games was actually profitable enough that everyone wanted to make one. As that craze died down in the late 90s, both bigger companies and indie developers have moved away from fighting games. But the doujin scene in Japan would continue to evolve and give us more unique, daring and interesting fighting games. In the year 2000, there was Eternal Fighter Zero from Tasogare Frontier. And just 2 years later, we would get the original Melty Blood from French Bread. Outside of Japan, the scene wouldn't get revitalized until Street Fighter 4, which showed everyone that people are still really into classic fighting games. It paved the way for Mortal Kombat returning to its roots and Marvel making a huge comeback just a few years later. And that's when indie games picked up in a big way, with Schoolgirls serving as a triumph and a historical milestone for the indie scene, especially in the West. After that we saw Punch Planet, Them's Fighting Hurts, Fantasy Strike and Yadagarasu. Sadly though, while Schoolgirls must have inspired many to enter the genre, none of them did nearly as well. And even Schoolgirls is falling apart, although for entirely different reasons. The unfortunate reality is that these games face challenges so insurmountable that not even the most passionate and hardworking developers can overcome them. From our position as customers, it's easy to say, well, just make a good game and people will play it. Yet, if we try to look at it from the standpoint of a developer, the plank for what FGC would consider good is impossibly high. And this is true for a lot of multiplayer games. They simply do not age or function the same way as single player. You wouldn't say, why would I play Avowed when I already have Skyrim? You already played Skyrim. In fact, you played too much Skyrim. But when it comes to multiplayer, old classics are not so easily replaced. There are people who still play StarCraft over StarCraft 2. Age of Empires 2 got 2 sequels, and yet this game from 1999 is still the most popular one. Arena shooters? Same thing. There have been so many iterations on Quake 3, but turns out that people would just rather play Quake 3. Indie fighting games have to compete against all other games on the market, and unless you're Jet Li, John Matrix or Lu Bu, well, that's just not happening. If you don't have some crazy cool or unique style, you're not beating the classic sprite animations, or the gloss of modern 3D games. You can also forget about big rosters. Most of the time you'd be lucky to have more than 8 fully fleshed out characters. Anything above that is basically a luxury. Indie games just don't have the budgets to match the sort of content that people expect from fighting games. And since they don't make much money, you can't expect much of a post-launch support. But that's not to say that these games are only held back by external factors. Some indie games ask for frankly unreasonable prices relative to what they offer. Many of them also have clear inspirations. It's kind of easy to tell when someone is making their own version of Street Fighter, Guilty Gear or KOF. And this never works out in their favor. Instead, it only invites very unfavorable comparisons. Finally, you can't blame these games for not having a lot of players, but they absolutely can and should consider matchmaking options that account for this. It is difficult, but it is also necessary. While it might exist, there is no clear path for indie developers to overcome these adversities. More original ideas can help them to stand out. For example, 10 years from now, Checkmate Showdown might still be the only game that mixes fighters with chess. The same way Mega Knockdown will probably continue to appear in any discussion about unique takes on the genre. However, the metrics still show that being unique doesn't mean being profitable. As players, we can also try to make this situation better. A lot of people in the FGC have this mindset that every fighting game needs to be something monumental. Something that you can grind for years and possibly compete in. When given a choice, they would rather put another 10 hours into SF6 than play a few matches in any other game. It doesn't have to be this way. Fighting games, especially simpler, smaller ones, can be something that you enjoy for only a few hours, or maybe a few dozen hours. It might be free, or at least cheap, and in exchange you get a new experience, something fresh, something that might help you to find a new perspective on the genre and your personal preferences. It's especially great if you have some gaming buddies who are down for a quick 1v1. And even if you don't plan on playing these games but think they look cool, I'm sure developers will appreciate something as simple as a shoutout. Thank you to those who watched all the way to the end. See you next time.